So Baldur's Gate 3 is probably the biggest game of 2023, and there are tons of mechanics and things it throws at you. I really wished I knew a lot of them and what they meant early on, so today we're gonna go over everything a complete beginner should know before proceeding. Also, to celebrate the launch, I'm giving away 2 copies of Baldur's Gate 3 on a platform of your choice. You only have to be sub to the channel, leave a like on the video, and comment down below what's your favorite aspect of the game. So let's begin making sense of the damage rolls and why having a weapon or spell with higher numbers doesn't necessarily mean you'll deal higher damage. So going over something like the Sword of Justice, at the top we have a damage range between 6 and 16, and beneath it we see the formula that actually gives us this number, which is basically the dice roll that achieves this. So whenever you see a formula like this, such as 2d6 plus 4, 1d4, 1d8, and so on, that one indicates a dice roll, exactly like how you would manually if you were to play a physical tabletop game, except that in this case, it's the game that does it for you. Now, in the case of this formula, D stands for dice, and the 2 behind it indicates the number of dice that get rolled, in this case, 2 of them. The number in the front, in this case 6, will indicate the number of faces that the dice have, so meaning it can roll a number between 1 to 6. The higher this number is, the better, because it means you have a chance to roll higher numbers, and there are even dice in there that go all the way up to the 8, 12, and even the 20. So in this case, we are rolling 2 6-sided dice and then add a plus 4 points of extra damage on top of them, giving you exactly the damage range between 4 to 16 when adding it all up. But like I said, this doesn't mean this is the final damage number that you'll see on enemies, as there are many other factors that influence that final result, including enemy weaknesses, possible resistances, effects over time, if you have advantage or disadvantage, and so on. That is why until you get to learn what each type of enemy does and doesn't have, use the examine tool in combat by simply right-clicking on these enemies and look out for any resistances or weak points they might feature. So for example, you don't want to bring a slashing greatsword weapon against a target that has a resistance to that, when a bludgeoning weapon could deal double damage even if technically the item in question is weaker than your greatsword. Similarly, spell resistances are just as important, as enemies can be resistant or even immune to certain portions of that damage, which is what you'll typically see right here in this window. And finally, don't forget you can combo certain effects with one another to enhance their potency in certain ways. For example, you can create water around your enemies and then combine this with a shock spell, which will extend to a much greater area and will even affect a lot more enemies, removing their reactions and even having a chance to stun them. Or you could use a frost ray and have a puddle freeze, which in turn can make enemies slip and fall prone, giving you an advantage against them. Also, grease can work wonders, pretty much also providing a nice way for enemies to slip, but you can also set this on fire and provide a damage over time effect if enemies linger by. Moving on to number 2, unlike other RPGs, and again borrowing from the tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, instead of using typical resources like mana or energy, BG3 uses a system of actions and bonus actions, or primary and secondary resources. Now, actions are the most common and are generally given to you by your class and equipment choices. So these can be either the melee attacks that you get from having proficiency with certain types of weapons like cleaves, lacerates, and other types of attacks, all the way up to spells that you get by having a certain choice of class, even various movements that all characters get like jump, hide, dash, and so on. They also count as actions. Now, typically you can only cast one of these actions per turn. However, certain builds and subclasses can provide abilities that let you cast a lot more of them, such as for example the fighter's action surge or the extra attack passive, which let you cast another action after the first one in the same turn. Also, you'll almost never want to end a turn without using an action, as that just leaves too much opportunity to go to waste in the favor of your enemies. Now, bonus actions are exactly what they sound like, an additional and separate action you can use in the same turn on top of the normal actions. Typically, you can see what type of action a move or attack is by simply looking at the green dot or orange triangle at the lower end of their tooltip, or by filtering by these at the top of the tooltip. Certain classes can gain bonus action attacks as they level up, but certain items and weapons can also provide them and will usually indicate if they do so. Just like normal actions, you also get to use only one of your bonus actions per turn, assuming you have multiple to choose between on the same character. There are, however, some exceptions to this rule, such as for example the Rogue, which gains some extra bonus actions and even has 2 bonus actions per turn rather than just one via the Thief subclass once it levels up. Also good to note is that offhand attacks also count as bonus actions, so equipping 2 daggers on a rogue will provide you with 2 attacks instead of just 1 in the same turn. Finally, there's also the spell slots and the skill charges. However, these function relatively similar and you can think of them as sort of like your ammo count for certain abilities. So on top of counting as actions or bonus actions, some of your attacks can also have an additional spell slot or skill charge requirement, where using this action will consume from your existing and limited slots or charges. Typically, these slots or charges only replenish after a long rest, so once they are consumed, you won't be able to use that action that requires them in the first place until after you've taken a long rest. So this can include anything like the Paladin Smites, many of the Wizard spells also use spell slots, and plenty more classes in there that have these. And you will have a limited number of charges per combat that you can use before having to take that long rest. Now, some of the classes start with more spell slots than others, and some will even gain extra ones as they level up, such as the Wizard, which gets level 1s, level 2s, and a number of level 3s as well. This means that you don't really want any single fight to take too many turns if you have limited spell slots or charges, as that puts you at a risk of consuming them before the fight is over, which means you're not going to be able to cast the spells or the attacks that require them. And finally, certain spells only consume a certain level of spell slot. So for example, if you use a level 1 spell, it will use or consume a level 1 spell slot. Meanwhile, a level 2 will consume a level 2 spell slot, and so on. Now, should you look into saving your spell slots, this is where Cantrips can help you by providing an extra ranged attack or utility that does not consume these in the first place, such as for example Firebolt, Sacred Flame, Mage Hand, Light, Eldritch Blast, and there's plenty more in there too. Now, Cantrips tend to be awesome on any class, but are also great as an alternative for when you don't want to expand your limited spell slots, but still want to be useful in, for example, dealing damage from range or providing some sort of utility to your party. Additionally, Cantrips can be a great alternative when your class doesn't really use Dexterity, which would otherwise buff ranged weapons. So you still want to use ranged attacks but don't have ranged weapons, you can use some of these Cantrips instead, such as for example the Firebolt. Additionally, Cantrips scale up with whatever casting stat is associated with the class or feat that gave you that access to that cantrip in the first place. And on top of that, it also takes into account your character level, meaning that your natural progression and point investment into your best stats will also help you boost the damage on these cantrips without having to do too many sacrifices. Classes like the Warlock, which for example use the Eldritch Blast cantrip, even get class upgrades for this spell to further enhance it with additional pushback effects or even make it deal additional damage. At number 4, what you should do very often is to take a rest. Pretty much after every fight, you should take some kind of rest because that is going to be the main way in which you replenish your party's HP and your used spells. Plus, there is also no restriction to this, so only benefits. In BG3, you get access to a short as well as a long rest, which you can access by bringing up their respective submenus on the bottom right section of your UI. In the short rest, which you can use outside of combat, this is instant, it doesn't consume any resources, but it only recovers a portion of your party's HP and some of the used spells. Since you get access to 2 short rests per long rest, you can use this after a fight to gain back some of your hit points, even revive some of your fallen teammates, and regain some of the spells so that you can immediately jump into the next fight. However, the long rest is the one that fully replenishes everything. All the spells, the full HP, actions, everything, but this actively has to teleport you to your camp as well as consume camp supplies in order to work. So you will need to have enough food or supplies to meet the minimum requirement of 40 out of 40 to be able to take a full-on rest. That is why it's highly advisable to loot everything that you see in your path, especially crates and bonfires, which typically have a lot of food and camp supplies stored inside of them. This brings us to number 5, and the next big tip is to loot absolutely everything. There is so much useful loot in Baldur's Gate 3, like super strong armors and build defining weapons that you can find literally within the first few starting hours of playing. Oftentimes they drop from big tough brutes like bosses and whatnot that you have to defeat, but even more often they come from the most inconspicuous places, such as a random small treasure chest that might be in the corner of a random tunnel, randomly being scattered in the environment, like being placed on a table, and even being given to you from random dialogue conversations. In this case, using the Alt key on your keyboard to highlight items in the world can help a ton to spot these more easily if you don't want to miss them. But other times, these items can only be found by completing certain puzzles or finding special items to open up secret rooms that give you access to them in the first place. So it's always a good idea to read up on the items that you find and on the notes that might give you some clues and even point you towards certain locations that might hold a very awesome item to have. Sometimes it can be as random as putting on a ring, which will open up a secret basement to give you a really cool item. Also be mindful when acquiring these items through stealing, which is yes also a possibility, as this can get you in trouble with the locals. You'll know when you're about to steal something as the interaction button is now featured in the color red. If however you do want to resort to stealing, then either do it without being detected, or if you do get caught, make sure you're able to talk your way out of it, because that can save you from a lot of trouble. And this brings us to number 6. Having a character with a high charisma in your party can save you from a lot of trouble, bring unique interactions, and provide unique rewards, on top of the fact that it can generally let you avoid combat entirely. Now, you shouldn't focus exclusively on damage and defenses in Baldur's Gate 3, but also on classes that use the charisma stat extensively, such as the paladins, sorcerers, the bards, or the warlocks. Having one of these in your party can be of tremendous help, as they can literally intimidate, persuade, or use deception to talk their way out of pretty much anything that gets you in trouble, avoid fights, or even have useful information provided to you so that you know how to proceed going ahead. These conversations will also rely on a die roll, but are also heavily influenced by how much charisma stat you have, your level of proficiency with that action that you're trying to complete, but also there are various cantrips and other spells from your existing party mates that can provide additional points on these ability checks, such as for example using guidance as a bonus roll that you get from Shadowheart to increase your chances for a higher roll in these dialogue conversations. Plus, there are lots of moments when picking the friendly route can unlock new vendors to trade with and gain access to their stash, which can also result in gaining access to powerful new items. At number 7, another important mechanic to take into account, especially if you tend to miss a lot, is the advantage and the disadvantage. These are special modifiers that heavily influence the success rate of hitting your enemies. Now, some of these advantage mechanics include attacking from high ground when hidden or against blind targets, when enemies are prone, against paralyzed or restricted enemies, and plenty more on top. But by far the easiest of them all is to simply have high ground over your enemy, or simply being on an elevated position compared to your target, especially when you're using ranged attacks. You will know if you have an advantage over these enemies by simply taking a look at the green advantage indicator beneath their HP, which will show you the type of advantage that you have against them. Equally, you also don't want to attack enemies with a ranged attack or spell when too close to them, as this can be a source of disadvantage, giving you a threatened debuff, which is going to reduce the chances of you to hit that target. Other common sources of disadvantage include attacking prone enemies with ranged attacks instead of melee, attacking enemies in poor light conditions, such as in caves and other dark places, or without using a source of light, or just making an attack on an enemy that has the high ground over you. Additionally, there are spells and mechanics in BG3 that can further force advantage rolls on your target, such as for example the cleric's guiding bolt, which grants advantage on the next attack roll against the affected target. Plus, certain abilities like the rogue sneak attacks will always ensure you get an advantage when using them, though these will require you to be in stealth mode when using them. And speaking of careful planning, using the game's turn-based mode via shift plus spacebar can let you have a more precise control over how you want to engage with your enemies and more easily take them by surprise. This comes in handy when sneaking around or when something happens too quickly on the screen and when you want to stop it just at the right moment. So let's say, for example, there's a guard or a patrol that moves a lot and it just got out of your line of sight so that you can sneak right behind the entire party. You can immediately press shift and space to stop them at the exact right moment. It's actually very advantageous to do this when you spot a group roaming around before they detect you, because if you attack them first before they detect you, this lets you take them by surprise. Essentially, this is a mechanic that gives you an extra turn to just attack them and be free at doing everything you want with them before they have a chance to react against you. You can also make this kind of planning by pressing G to turn off group mode and move each character individually, but since that's all happening in real time, it can ruin your entire plan. You can, however, use Shift plus C to make all party members go stealth at the same time and avoid detection in case you're just trying to control them a little bit more efficiently. And finally, to number 9, let's talk about companions. You will want to bring as many diverse classes and roles in your party as you can to make the most out of their synergies. Generally speaking, you should always have a melee strength user, frontliner, something that can survive relatively well, has plenty of damage, and can stay up in enemies' face, such as the barbarians, fighters, and paladins. Also, you will want a support in your party, something like a cleric or a bard, that can provide strong buffs to better increase your odds against them, resurrect fallen allies, or simply debuff enemies to the point they become useless. The third member should be a spellcaster, preferably from range, so that you can deal really high damage from afar. This is where classes like the wizard or the sorcerer really excel because they have a lot of access to these types of attacks, which can pretty much wipe out an entire battlefield. The final member can be anything that you see fit. If you find something that's fun to play around or you just like a particular character to have around you, you can totally add them to your existing party as a last member. It could be a rogue, for example, which you can find very useful for lockpicking and stealing if you do that very often, or a second damage dealer when you think you're lacking with the primary one. But BG3 also leaves a lot of room for romancing many of the companions and NPCs that you meet in your journey, including Shadowheart, Gale, Astarion, Lae'zel, Will, Karlach, and many more. Even if you don't end up romancing any of these, it's always worth it to at least try to get them in your party when you meet them or sending them at your camp, as they can all prove to be valuable allies in combat. Now, as you bring these characters with you on your journeys and depending on your dialogue options, this will influence how much they approve of you, which is going to further make it possible to romance them later on. So you will see this by their approval or disapproval reaction whenever you choose a certain dialogue option, and each of these characters kind of have their own ideology that they follow and will oftentimes either agree or disagree with your own actions. However, most of the romancing will be done back at your camp and after passing certain story moments, which will give you the chance to get closer to these characters, connect a bit more on a personal level, and even have scenes that you otherwise cannot get unless you get that really high approval. And finally, to number 10, we have a few more bonus tips that I thought would be worth mentioning. One of them is that you will want to constantly manual save by pressing F5. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't actually autosave too often, so it's important to do this frequently so that you don't have to roll back in case you wiped your entire party and the last save game was several hours before this happened. Or you can even save in the middle of fights if you want to ensure the best possible outcome in case you're hunting for a specific item, or if your save's coming to get the best possible dialogue options. Another one is to be careful when moving away from an enemy during fights, because this can trigger an opportunity attack where they can hit you without expending any actions. So instead, take a look at the disengage bonus section, which lets you escape these situations without triggering opportunity attacks and as such without getting you hit. Another one, if you're having trouble hitting enemies, especially in dark places, just light up the area with spells such as light, for example, which is going to increase your chances to hit that enemy drastically compared to not having it at all. Also, if fallen party members are too far away from your character, casting something like a healing word or any other ranged healing spell can immediately resurrect them and provide some extra healing to bring them back into combat so that you don't have to move to them manually. Anyway, this is it with the video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.